The house on Willow Street was unlike any other, with its sturdy oak door and white shutters that glimmered like eyes watching the world beyond. The house was large but lived in, worn but not neglected, like the people inside it. Evelyn worked there for nearly 2 decades, her hands molding into the woodwork, her footsteps blending with the creak of the floorboards. The family trusted her with everything: the cleaning, the meals, even the raising of young Peter, the quiet boy with wide, curious eyes and questions Evelyn didn't always have answers to. It was a home, but not hers. A job, but more than a job. Evelyn knew the lines, even when they blurred, and she crossed none. The day was bright, too bright for the unease that lingered in the air. Something wasn't quite right, and Evelyn felt it in her bones before she knew what it was. She glanced at the clock above the kitchen sink, wiping her hands on her apron. Mrs. Henderson, her employer, had already left for her charity luncheon, leaving her alone with Peter. Evelyn called out for him, her voice echoing through the empty hallways, but there was no answer. Hannah nodded her as she climbed the stairs, each step slower than the last. "Peter," she whispered, her heart pounding now. She found him on the balcony, his small frame perched dangerously close to the edge, eyes wide, transfixed by something far below. Her voice caught in her throat as she moved toward him, but he was already teetering, arms outstretched like a bird ready to take flight. Evelyn lunged forward without thinking, pulling him back just as his foot slipped. They both fell hard onto the balcony floor, her arms wrapped tightly around him, the breath knocked out of her chest. Peter clung to her, trembling, and she held him until the world righted itself again. But when Mrs. Henderson returned, there were no tears of relief. "No thanks." Her eyes blazed with something Evelyn had never seen before: accusation. "How could you let this happen?" she spat. "You were supposed to watch him, protect him." Evelyn tried to explain, tried to tell her that she had saved Peter's life, but her words were drowned out by Mrs. Henderson's rage. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that Peter had almost fallen, and that, in Mrs. Henderson's mind, was Evelyn's fault. By the end of the week, Evelyn was no longer employed at the house on Willow Street. The dismissal was swift and cold, a letter delivered by Mrs. Henderson herself, hands stiff and eyes colder than the winter rain that began to fall. There was no severance, no farewell. Just silence. Evelyn watched the car pull away, the rain streaking down the windows, and wondered how everything had fallen apart so quickly. For days, Evelyn sat in her small apartment, staring at the walls that seemed to close in on her. Her heart ached not for the loss of the job, but for Peter. The boy she had watched grow, whose laughter had filled the house on Willow Street, was now lost to her. It wasn't until the 3rd day, when the rain had finally stopped, that Evelyn heard the knock at her door. She opened it to find a man standing there, dressed in a crisp suit that looked out of place in her worn-down building. His face was stern, unreadable, but his eyes, they flickered with something she couldn't name. "Miss Evelyn?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. She nodded, unsure of what to say. "I believe we need to talk," he said, his words hanging in the air like a question without an answer. Evelyn stood in the doorway, the weight of the man's words settling over her like a thin, suffocating fog. His presence was too sharp for the softness of her small apartment, a place she had carved out for herself after leaving the grandeur of Willow Street. The suit he wore seemed almost an affront to her worn jeans and the faded sweater she had pulled over her shoulders to keep out the chill. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady though her heart thrummed like a bird in a cage. The man didn't blink. He didn't smile either. Instead, he straightened his tie and said, "My name is Daniel. I represent a party with an interest in what happened at the Henderson house." Interest? Evelyn's mind spun. Why would anyone be interested in her? A simple housekeeper who had lost her job under the most bewildering of circumstances. But there was something in Daniel's eyes, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps knowledge, that told her this visit wasn't about accusations. It was something more. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice polite but firm, like a man who was used to getting what he wanted. For a moment, Evelyn considered saying no. There was a heaviness to him, a kind of weight that suggested whatever he had come to say would change something. She had had enough of change, enough of people knocking her world off balance. But the curiosity was stronger. That and the fact that, beneath it all, there was a quiet need for something to make sense again. "Sure," she replied, stepping aside to let him into her apartment. Daniel entered, his polished shoes making almost no sound on the scuffed floor. He took in his surroundings with a practiced glance, eyes grazing over the modest furniture, the mismatched curtains, and the small collection of books stacked in a corner. But there was no judgment in his gaze, just observation, as if he were cataloging everything, placing it neatly in a file in his mind. Evelyn offered him a seat at the small table by the window, and he accepted, folding himself into the chair with the ease of someone who had sat at 1,000 tables just like this one. "I'll get right to the point, Ms. Evelyn," he said, his tone suddenly more formal, as though they had stepped into a room where only facts and truths were spoken. What happened at the Henderson house, specifically with young Peter, was not a mere accident. Evelyn's chest tightened. The memory of Peter on the balcony, his small body tipping dangerously toward the edge, came rushing back to her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her hands clenching in her lap. Daniel's gaze softened just a fraction, as if he understood that what he was about to say would unsettle her. "I mean that Peter wasn't supposed to be on that balcony. Someone made sure he was there." The words landed hard, almost knocking the breath from Evelyn. "Are you saying someone tried to hurt him?" The thought was absurd, yet it gnawed at her like an unwelcome truth she had tried to ignore. Daniel hesitated for the first time, choosing his next words carefully. "It's more complicated than that. But what I can tell you is that your actions that day, saving him, interrupted something." Evelyn felt a chill crawl up her spine, not from the cold of the room, but from the implications of what Daniel was saying. Interrupted what? Who would want to hurt a child like Peter? Her voice was rising now, her confusion and fear bubbling over. Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped together as if he were about to deliver a sermon. "Not everyone in Peter's life has his best interests at heart, Ms. Evelyn. And not everything that happens in that house is as innocent as it appears." Evelyn shook her head, unwilling to believe it. The Hendersons were distant, yes, but malicious? No. Not Mrs. Henderson, with her sharp words but genuine concern for her son. Not Mr. Henderson, whose absence was as much a part of the house as the old wallpaper. They loved Peter, didn't they? As if reading her thoughts, Daniel added, "There are forces at play here that you may never fully understand. But you were fired because you saved Peter, not because you failed him." The room seemed to close in on Evelyn as she tried to make sense of it all. It was too much. Too strange. "Why are you telling me this? What does any of it have to do with me now?" Daniel straightened, his gaze locking with hers. "Because you did what no one else could. You protected Peter. And there are people who want to ensure that never happens again." Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. "What are you saying?" He rose from his chair, smoothing his suit. "I'm saying that your role in Peter's life isn't over. Not yet." With that, he handed her a card, the white paper stark against his dark skin. "If you ever feel like someone is watching you, or if anything happens, call me." And then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Evelyn standing there, the card trembling in her hands. The only sound was the wind rattling the windows, and the only thing she knew for certain was that her life had shifted in a way she could never have predicted. The days passed slowly after Daniel's visit, each one heavier than the last. Evelyn couldn't shake the conversation, couldn't let go of the feeling that her dismissal from the Hendersons' home was wrapped in something darker than she had imagined. His words echoed in her mind, underscore, "Not everyone in Peter's life has his best interests at heart." Underscore. The mornings blurred together in her small apartment. Her routine, once filled with the comforting tasks of caring for Peter, had turned hollow. She no longer rose at dawn to prepare breakfast for the boy or hear his soft laughter as he told her about his dreams. She missed him, more than she could admit, but she also missed the predictability of the life she had lost. Now, nothing felt certain. Evelyn found herself reaching for the card Daniel had left behind. She would pick it up, trace the simple black lettering, _Daniel D. Freeman _, and put it down again. She wasn't sure what she expected to happen if she called. Some part of her wished she could go back to the time before any of this. Before the balcony, before the knock on her door. But deep down, she knew it was too late for that. By the fourth day, something changed. Evelyn was on her way back from the small market near her apartment when she noticed a car parked across the street from her building. A sleek, black car that seemed to absorb the light around it. There was nothing inherently strange about a car parked in a neighborhood like hers. People came and went all the time. But as she approached, she felt a pair of eyes on her. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat, and glanced up at the window across from hers. There, standing by the window, was a woman. Her silhouette was familiar, though Evelyn couldn't place her face. The woman's eyes were on her, and for a brief moment, Evelyn felt as if she were being scrutinized, as if her every movement was being catalogued. She quickly looked away, her heart racing. She hurried inside, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the key to her apartment door. Once inside, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to steady her breathing. The sense of unease had returned, creeping into her like the cold air outside. She knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. That night, Evelyn dreamt of Peter. In the dream, she was back at the house on Willow Street, standing in the kitchen. She could hear the faint sound of Peter's voice, calling out to her from somewhere in the house, but when she tried to follow the sound, she couldn't move. Her feet were stuck to the floor, as if the house itself were holding her back. She called his name, over and over, but the walls swallowed her voice, and the silence grew until it filled her ears with an unbearable weight. She woke up in a sweat, the darkness of her bedroom pressing in around her. For a moment, she thought she heard a knock at the door, soft but distinct. Her heart leapt in her chest, and she held her breath, listening. Nothing. Evelyn sat up, her eyes scanning the room. She had lived alone for so long now, but in that moment, she felt the weight of another presence in the air, something watching, something waiting. She reached for the small lamp on the bedside table, its warm light flooding the room and chasing away the shadows. But the feeling remained. The next morning, Evelyn couldn't shake the sense that she was being followed. As she walked through the market, she caught glimpses of the same dark car circling the block. She felt the weight of eyes on her again, but when she turned to look, there was no one, just the faces of strangers, too preoccupied with their own lives to care about hers. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, she reached for Daniel's card again. This time, her fingers lingered over the numbers, and before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed. The phone rang once, twice, and then, "Ms. Evelyn?" Daniel's voice came through, calm and steady, as if he had been expecting her call. "Yes, it's me," she whispered, glancing around her apartment as though someone might be listening. "I think someone's watching me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, Daniel spoke, his voice firm. "I'll be there in an hour. Don't open the door for anyone else." Evelyn's heart raced as she hung up the phone, a mixture of relief and fear coursing through her veins. She paced the room, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? What had she been pulled into by saving Peter that day? True to his word, Daniel arrived an hour later. His knock was soft but deliberate, and when Evelyn opened the door, she was met with the same composed expression he had worn the first time they met. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on her. "You did the right thing by calling me," he said, his voice low but reassuring. "There are things you don't know yet, Ms. Evelyn. but I promise, I'll help you understand. Evelyn swallowed, her throat dry. What's happening to me? Why are they watching me? Daniel's gaze softened, and for the first time, Evelyn saw something almost like sympathy in his eyes. Because, Miss Evelyn, he said slowly, you weren't just protecting Peter from a fall. You were protecting him from something much bigger. Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. And for the first time, she realized that she was part of something far beyond her control. Evelyn sat across from Daniel, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched her mug of tea, though she hadn't taken a sip. The words he had spoken moments ago still hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. Something bigger, she echoed, her voice a whisper. What do you mean by that? Who would want to harm Peter? He's just a boy. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his posture calm despite the weight of the conversation. His suit, immaculate as always, contrasted sharply with the worn edges of Evelyn's furniture. Peter may be just a boy, he began slowly, but he's more than that to some people. His family, the Hendersons, they're involved in things you may not know about. Powerful things. Evelyn's brow furrowed. The Hendersons? They were just an ordinary wealthy family, weren't they? Mrs. Henderson had always been preoccupied with her charity luncheons, her social standing in the town, while Mr. Henderson was more of a ghost in their lives, rarely seen but ever present in the fabric of the household. I don't understand, Evelyn murmured, more to herself than to Daniel. What could any of this have to do with Peter? Daniel hesitated, as though weighing how much to reveal. You see, the Hendersons come from an old family. Generations of wealth, influence, and connections. Some of those connections extend far beyond the social circles they inhabit. Peter, being the only child, carries a certain legacy. A legacy? Evelyn asked, still struggling to make sense of his words. What kind of legacy? Daniel's eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. One that isn't entirely his choice to bear. And the people involved, they're willing to go to extreme lengths to ensure their interests are protected. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. When you saved Peter that day, you disrupted something important, something those people had put in motion. Evelyn's hands gripped her mug tighter, her knuckles white. Her mind raced, replaying the events of that day on the balcony. Could it really be that someone had wanted Peter to fall? The thought made her stomach turn, and yet, Daniel's calm, measured tone left little room for disbelief. Why would they want to hurt him, she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. He's just a child. Daniel shifted, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. It's not about Peter as a person, but what he represents. There are forces that see him as a threat, or as a key to something they want. His parents, or at least those in their orbit, are part of a network that deals in power, real power. But that power comes at a cost, and Peter is the currency. Evelyn felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had been a housekeeper in their home for years, watching Peter grow, believing the family to be distant but harmless. Now, she was faced with the reality that she had never truly understood the house she had worked in. What kind of power, she asked, almost afraid of the answer. Influence, Daniel replied, choosing his words carefully. Control. The kind that moves behind the scenes, shaping lives, shifting the future. Peter's role in all of this isn't entirely clear yet, but he's more valuable than you can imagine. Evelyn stared down into her untouched tea, her mind swirling with confusion and dread. And they wanted me gone because I interfered? Daniel nodded. When you saved Peter, you altered the course they had planned. To them, you're a liability now. They can't risk you being close to him, or knowing too much. But they also know they can't harm you directly. Not without drawing attention. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. So, what happens now? Do I just wait for them to come after me? Is Peter still in danger? Daniel's expression grew more serious. Peter is always in danger, in a way. The people involved aren't the kind to give up easily. But that's where you come in, Ms. Evelyn. Whether you realize it or not, you've become an important piece in this. They'll be watching you, trying to figure out what you know, what you might do. Evelyn's heart raced. But I don't know anything. Not yet, Daniel said, his voice low but firm. But you have something far more valuable than knowledge. You have Peter's trust. And that's why they fear you. The room seemed to grow colder as Evelyn absorbed his words. Trust. She had never thought of it that way before, but it made sense. Peter had always looked to her for comfort, for safety. In a house where his parents were often absent, Evelyn had been the constant in his life. And now, that connection had put her in the crosshairs of forces she could barely comprehend. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hope. What can I do? I'm just a housekeeper. You're more than that, Daniel replied, his voice steady. You've already done what no one else could. You kept Peter safe when it mattered most. And now, you need to decide if you're willing to keep protecting him. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was a choice she hadn't expected to face. All her life, she had lived in the shadows, content with her quiet existence, taking comfort in her simple role. But now, something was pulling her forward, urging her to step into a world that frightened her, a world that threatened not only Peter, but perhaps her own life as well. Daniel watched her, his eyes unwavering. You don't have to make a decision right now, he said, his tone gentler. But if you do, know that you won't be alone in this. I can help. I can make sure you're prepared for whatever comes next. Evelyn looked down at her hands, the lines of age and hard work etched into her skin. She had never imagined her life could take such a turn, that she could be standing on the edge of something so dangerous, so uncertain. But Peter's face, his wide, innocent eyes, flashed in her mind, and she knew, despite the fear, despite the unknown, she couldn't turn away. I'll do it, she whispered, her voice firm even as her heart pounded in her chest. I'll protect him. Daniel's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of respect, perhaps. Then we'll start preparing, he said, standing up. And whatever happens next, we'll face it together. As Daniel left her apartment, Evelyn felt the weight of her decision settle over her like a cloak. She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was something else now, something she hadn't fully grasped yet. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to let anything happen to Peter. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Daniel was a steady presence, guiding Evelyn through every step as she learned how to watch for the subtle signs of danger, how to blend into the background when necessary, and how to defend herself in ways that didn't involve violence. Each morning, they met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the same place each time, where Daniel would bring news of what was happening around the Hendersons and in Peter's life. Evelyn learned that Peter had been kept close to home after the incident. Mrs. Henderson had dismissed the staff she could no longer trust, the remaining employees operating under tight scrutiny. Peter was never left alone, not even for a moment, though his safety came at the cost of his freedom. He was being watched, both by his parents and the forces Daniel warned about, trapped in a gilded cage he couldn't understand. The world outside Evelyn's apartment had shifted, becoming a place of whispers and shadows, where nothing was as it seemed. She moved through her days cautiously, her eyes always scanning her surroundings for anything out of place, the car parked too long in the same spot, the stranger whose gaze lingered a second too long. One evening, after their usual meeting, Daniel lingered longer than usual. They sat in the fading light of the cafe, the hum of quiet conversations around them blending into the background. It's almost time, Daniel said, his voice low. Evelyn stiffened. For what? To make your move. The Hendersons are preparing for something. and I have reason to believe Peter's going to be a part of it. Evelyn felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What are they planning? Daniel glanced around before leaning in. There's an event happening this weekend. A charity gala, on the surface. But behind the scenes, it's a gathering of powerful people, people who have their hands in what's happening with Peter. They're watching closely, trying to ensure everything goes according to their plan. And if Peter is brought there, he won't be coming back the same. The weight of his words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. What do you mean? Daniel's eyes darkened. They intend to initiate him into something, an agreement or bond that will tie him to their interests for life. Once that happens, he'll be beyond your reach. Beyond anyone's reach. They'll control him. Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. The thought of Peter being bound to these people, these faceless, shadowy forces, was unbearable. We have to stop it, she said, her voice trembling with urgency. We can't let them do this to him. Daniel nodded, his face set with determination. We will. But it won't be easy. They'll be watching everyone closely, and you won't have much time. But you're the only one Peter will trust. If you can get him out of there, I'll make sure you both disappear. The enormity of what he was asking hung heavy in the air. Evelyn had never imagined her life taking such a turn, fighting against powers she couldn't fully understand, risking everything to save a boy who had once been just her responsibility, but had now become her heart. I'll do it, Evelyn said, her voice firm. Whatever it takes, I'll get him out. Daniel reached across the table, his hand resting on hers briefly. Then we'll be ready. The night of the gala arrived with an eerie stillness. Evelyn stood outside the grand estate where the event was being held, her breath shallow as she scanned the rows of cars and the elegantly dressed guests moving inside. She had managed to slip in with the catering staff, her former experience in the Henderson household giving her the edge she needed to blend in unnoticed. Inside, the estate glittered with chandeliers and laughter, the opulence masking the undercurrent of tension that thrummed through the air. Evelyn moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning for Peter. She knew he was here somewhere, and she had only a small window of time before it was too late. As she rounded a corner near the back of the estate, her breath caught in her throat. There he was, Peter, standing near a grand staircase, dressed in a small, tailored suit. His face was pale, his eyes wide and searching the room as if he didn't quite know where he was or what was happening. He looked smaller than she remembered, his innocence clashing with the cold elegance of the world around him. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated, watching him from the shadows. This boy, who had once been just her charge, was now someone she would risk everything for. She had no family of her own, no ties that bound her to anyone but Peter. He had become her family, her purpose. Peter, she whispered, stepping closer. He turned at the sound of her voice, his eyes lighting up in recognition. Evelyn, he said softly, his voice filled with both surprise and relief. She knelt beside him, her hands resting on his shoulders. I'm going to get you out of here, she whispered, her heart racing. But you have to trust me, okay? Peter nodded, his small hand slipping into hers. I trust you. Without another word, they moved quickly through the halls, Evelyn's heart pounding with each step. She had memorized the layout of the estate, knowing there was a side exit near the back that would lead them to the gardens, away from the prying eyes of the guests and the security guards who patrolled the main entrance. As they reached the door, Evelyn's hand trembled as she pushed it open. The cool night air hit her face, sharp and cleansing. They were almost there. But as they stepped out into the garden, a voice cut through the night. Evelyn. She froze, turning slowly to see Mrs. Henderson standing in the shadows, her face unreadable, a mix of anger and sorrow etched into her features. I knew it would be you, Mrs. Henderson said softly. You've always had a soft spot for him. Evelyn's pulse quickened, her grip tightening on Peter's hand. I'm taking him away from all of this. I'm not letting you use him like this. Mrs. Henderson's eyes darkened, But there was no malice in her voice, only a tired resignation. "You don't understand. It's not a choice for us. It never has been." "It's a choice for me," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. "And I'm choosing to protect him." For a long moment, Mrs. Henderson stared at them, her expression unreadable. Then, with a heavy sigh, she stepped back. "Go. Before anyone else sees you." Evelyn blinked in surprise, but wasted no time. She nodded once, then turned and hurried with Peter into the night, the weight of Mrs. Henderson's gaze following them. As they reached the gate at the edge of the garden, Evelyn felt the world shift around her. She had done it. Peter was safe. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew they would face it together. In the distance, she saw a car's headlights flash twice. Daniel was waiting, just as he had promised. And for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt hope stir in her chest. She had saved Peter once again, and this time, there would be no going back.